First, you've been watching. President Trump just gave his first major international speech moments ago in Saudi Arabia. He focused on Islamic extremism, but the focus here at home has been on all the news leaking out of the White House the last week, and it was a dizzying week. Joining me now to help put this in perspective, legendary reporter, former host of Face and a political contributor of CBS News, Bob Schieffer. Thanks so much for being with us. In a commentary this week titled "The What If President," based on an interview you did with John McCain, in what he said that we have seen this movie before, Bob. John McCain said, we have seen this movie before. So to you, what does this moment in time feel like?
Well, we have seen this movie before, and the parallels between this and Watergate are striking. You saw the Richard Nixon tried to crush the investigation. He fired the special prosecutor. You saw much the same thing from President Trump over the last week. But again, today, you saw a very different President Trump. He actually sounded presidential. You may agree or disagree with what he said, but he sounded like a president. He laid out his vision. He called for help from those in the Muslim world. It was a much different kind of presentation. I mean, the president doesn't pay much attention to advice from others, but I would think if he just paid attention to himself today, this went over very well, mainly because he stayed on script. No tweets today, but a dignified speech.
No tweets of any real interest in the last few days. In fact, Bob, by asking the question, or calling this the what-if presidency, are you suggesting that this crisis that he was in or is in, even before this trip to Saudi Arabia, is of his own making? And by noting today that he gave a speech which was a coherent foreign policy, are you noting that he could unmake this crisis also?
Well, I think there are very few people would disagree with me when I say he helped himself today. Because he didn't sound like the guy at the end of the bar popping off. He sounded like someone who had actually thought about what he was going to say before he said it.
You know, Bob, though, that there will be people who look at that last comment you just made and said, you're normalizing the president. You're saying because he met this admittedly very low bar for not sounding foolish, in fact, he was in fact presidential. What would you say to criticism like that?
Well, I'm not trying to normalize him in any way. I'm trying to do what reporters do, and that report and try to emphasize what I think was important here. I have many questions about this policy. For one thing, is he going to set off an arms race in the Middle East? Is Russia going to now begin selling arms to Iran? There are many things you can say about this. But again, he kept a hold on the tweets, he stuck to the script, and he sounded much different, not only than he sounded all of last week, but throughout the campaign. This was a different presentation today.
And you are reflecting it and analyzing it, which is a reporter's job. A reporter's job is to report and to analyze, but it is a challenging job. In this environment, Bob, Andrew Sullivan, the columnist, wrote this week. He said, in a serious crisis, more than half the country won't believe a word the president says, and yet around 35% of the country still somehow views every single catastrophe Trump perpetrates on America and the world as either a roaring triumph or a huge middle finger to the elites, and therefore fine. If that is in fact the case, that a third of the people are going to blame him for everything, a third of the people are never going to blame him for anything, what kind of challenge does that pose to a reporter?
Well, it's a challenge to all of us because many people don't believe anything that they hear anymore. This is a very, very deep divide in the country, John, and it didn't begin with Donald Trump.
Right.
It began a long time ago, and we've had people attack our institutions. We've had the Russians obviously meddling around, trying to encourage that. I have said before, Donald Trump was not responsible for the mood and the conditions in the country when he ran for president. He simply exploited that, and that's fair.